Hello. My name is Andrew Witkin, and on behalf of the International Fine Print Dealers Association, I'm honored to welcome you to what will definitively be a wonderful conversation today. This event is part of a great series of programs that happens throughout October for Print Month. All events, including this one, are being recorded, and they will all be available on the IFPDA's website shortly. One last bit of housekeeping. If you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as possible. And with that, it's my distinguished honor to introduce Elisa German. Elisa is a specialist in modern and contemporary works on paper with a focus on mid-20th century Spain. At present, she is serving a 2-year term as the president of the Association of Print Scholars and is currently working at the Harvard Art Museums as the Emily Rao Pulitzer Curatorial Fellow in Contemporary Drawings. And with that, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Andrew. As the president of the Association of Print Scholars, I would also like to welcome everyone to today's panel on behalf of APS and begin by saying that we're so happy to have been able to partner with IFPDA for Print Month. We want to thank Jenny Gibbs and Sherry Young for all of their assistance in organizing this incredible month-long series of events. Although many of you are already familiar with APS, I want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about the organization. The Association of Print Scholars was founded in 2014 as a nonprofit organization that seeks to encourage and support innovative and interdisciplinary approaches in the history and practice of printmaking. In addition to sponsoring a wide range of workshops, grants, and awards for those working in the field, with each year we continue to grow our membership in an effort to create an active community of scholars. With more than 500 members worldwide, including curators, artists, students, teachers, independent scholars, and print lovers, we encourage everyone who is interested in learning more about APS or in becoming a member to visit our website, printscholars.org. Now it is my pleasure to introduce one of our wonderful event coordinators, Nora Rosengarten, who conceived of and organized this panel. Nora is a Ph.D. candidate at Harvard University, where she is researching prints and printmaking from the 18th century to the present. Professionally, Nora has worked at the Phillips Collection, the Cleveland Museum of Art, and most recently was a curatorial assistant at the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute. I will now turn things over to Nora, who will introduce our speakers for this afternoon and begin the program. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Elisa. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm so delighted to be here today, and it's such an honor for me to introduce our wonderful panelists. Today, we will be speaking with Luis Camnitzer, Ursula Davila-Villa, and Liliana Porter. Ursula Davila-Villa is an art historian, an independent curator working with artists and their families on studio management, legacy planning, and stewardship. She was a partner at Alexander Gray Associates, associate curator of Latin American art at the Blanton Museum of Art at the University of Texas at Austin. In addition to numerous curatorial projects, in 2012, she was co-curator of El Panal, The Hive, third Polygraphica Triennial of San Juan de Puerto Rico. She holds an MA in Museum Studies from New York University. Liliana Porter studied at the Escuela Nacional de Bellas Artes in Buenos Aires and the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City. She has lived in New York since 1964. Her diverse oeuvre comprises printmaking, works on canvas, and time-based media, as well as installations and public art projects. Porter was awarded a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship and has also been the recipient of 3 New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowships, in addition to numerous other honors. She served as a professor at Queens College, City University of New York, from 1991 to 2007. Her work is in several major public and private collections internationally. Luis Camnitzer is a German-born Uruguayan artist and writer who moved to New York in 1964. He was at the vanguard of 1960s conceptualism, working primarily in printmaking, sculpture, and installations. Camnitzer's artwork explores subjects such as repression under systems of power, pedagogical norms, and the deconstruction of frameworks. His humorous, biting, and often politically charged use of language as an art medium has distinguished his practice for over 5 decades. His 2007 book, Conceptualism in Latin American Art, is widely considered one of the most influential texts on this subject. In 2018 and 2019, the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid presented a retrospective exhibition of his work. The recipient of numerous awards, Camnitzer was also the United States Artist Ford Fellow for the Visual Arts in 2012. I hope you will join me in welcoming our panelists for today. I'm eager to begin our conversation. I thought that we could get started by talking about the very beginnings of the New York Graphic Workshop. Here's a photograph of Porter Camnitzer and their co-collaborator, José Guillermo Castillo. And I was wondering if we could just begin at the very beginning, how you all met, how you began collaborating, and how you selected the name, the New York Graphic Workshop.
How it started? It started because in 1965, I was opening a show in a gallery, the Bovenkamp Gallery in New York, and Julian Firestone, a dentist that was also an amateur printmaker, came and offered me, he had an electric press in his penthouse in the Greenwich Village, and he offered me to use the press. So I immediately went and introduced him to Luis Camnitzer, and we were supposed to get married, I think the next week or something like that. And he was very happy to meet Luis because he already owned a print of him. And anyway, so we started to work in his penthouse, and a few days later he came and said, I have a surprise. And he had bought an incredible loft that he bought to another printmaker. So it was all installed like a dream for printmakers, and he offered this to us. So then we started there to make our own prints, to teach, and we also invited José Guillermo Castillo, and we founded the New York Graphic Workshop. You want to say something, Luis, that I didn't say? No?
It was sort of satire on the New York graphic. I don't remember what the name was. It was a prestigious New York graphic something.
New York Graphical Society.
Right. So we were making fun of that and riding on the publicity they might have.
Because they made reproductive prints of artworks, right? So yeah. There's a kind of a pun about printmaking as something that is only reproducing works of art by other people, the printmaker as a technician conveying someone else's message.
Yeah, precisely. The loft actually was fully equipped for printmaking. It was previously used by a printmaker by the name of Laszlo Kalapai. And it was a perfect space, so that it's there where we decided to also be a school for printmaking.
Yeah, I was curious to hear more about how soon the role that pedagogy and that teaching took, because that was something that I didn't know as much about, that the New York Graphic Workshop also was teaching and working with students, and students doing projects not just in print, but in different media also. How soon after you began working in the loft did you start taking students?
Pretty much immediately. We both had been working at Pratt Graphic Arts Center, and Pratt was really a very conservative place in which the teachers were all known by whatever techniques they were using. There was one working on polyvinylic chloride. Another one was working with an hydraulic press. And so another one was doing calligraphy. It was very technically oriented, and nobody really knew from the description what problems were they solving aesthetically. And we decided to change that in the studio and really focus on what the artist wanted to do, and then figure out what the best way to do it was, and help in terms of breaking down the borderlines of traditional printmaking accordingly.
Yes, that also opened, like we had the etching press and the litho press, but we were also opening ourselves to installations, other forms of to use the idea of the possibility of editions to other way formal solutions. No?
I think that that's a perfect transition to talking about the Manifesto Cookie, a kind of an application of print in an unusual medium. Would one of you like to talk about this, what it is, for anyone here that doesn't know?
Okay, one of the challenges for us as artists was, why does printmaking have to be two-dimensional? Why does it have to be on paper? Why basically are we still using the same techniques that Rembrandt was using or Dürer was using? And so also challenge, how comes the separation between industrial printing and art printing? Why did art printing stop in the 17th century, or with lithography, 19th century? Be reluctant to use silk screen over ages, although silk screen is thousands of years old. And so there was a kind of inertia in art printmaking, holding printmaking back, while industrial printing was all over the place and accepting all new techniques, which were reluctantly watched by artists. And that broke in the mid-60s, together with multiples and Gemini. And I mean, it wasn't just us. It was like, it was in the air. And we all participated in this breaking. Some did it for market reasons, and we did it for conceptual reasons. So one thing we started doing was Christmas cards, and the first, or the second one actually, was the idea of having a cookie made by a baker who promised it would be long lasting, which it wasn't. And we made the mold woodcut. I mean, it was a hybrid conceptually, and delivered it to the baker, and the baker made the edition. And then we mailed it. It was very nice because it put a lot of dilemmas to the people that got it, like MoMA. The Museum of Modern Art didn't know exactly what to do with it. They had a prohibition of having food in storage, and this was food. On the other hand, they couldn't dispose of artworks, and this was an artwork. And was this a document or a piece? So the museum at that time had 3 collections, I think. One of documents, one of arts just in case, and one of what they consider real art. So where did this cookie fit? And I imagine the board having endless discussions about what to do with the cookie, but we don't have a record of that.
I like that. I included here an excerpt from the manifesto that was sent with the cookie, which speaks exactly to what you were just saying, Luis, about the building blocks of printmaking being identified simultaneously with sort of mechanization, and also with these old processes that are hundreds of years old. And I was wondering if we might continue in this vein by talking about the concept of the FANSO, the free assemblable, non-functional, disposable serial object. When did you start using this term? How did it come to be? And in what ways is Manifesto Cookie emblematic of this term?
Liliana, do you want
Yeah,
to
yeah. No, you can say it. No, what happened is that we wanted to include all our interested, and Jose Castillo was more interested in the assemblable, right? And so I think we put everything together, but for instance, in the cookie, I don't think that all is disposable, is serial, it's an object, but it's not, let's say, free assemblable, no?
Yeah, I think maybe to talk about the Alfonso specifically, it makes sense to turn to the First Class Mail exhibition, which I think that the objects produced for this qualify in every single way. And this was an incredibly important contribution that you all made. And I was wondering if you might talk about the importance of mail specifically. Why create objects to travel through the mail? Why make mail art?
Well, it was a moment also that we were very interested in the dematerialization of art, in making, creating art that weren't objects, perceiving more ideas and processes that trigger other ideas. And this particular work was in the information show at MoMA, and it was like the persons who wanted to receive this exhibition by mail would put the name in envelopes and addresses, and what they would receive was actually exactly the same page, but instead of saying announces, it says, like in the second image, announced. So it was also a play with time, and I think it was like a poetic gesture too.
Definitely. Yeah, I feel like these works, which we will look at in more detail, really play out the tension between the conceptual and the material, because they are printed objects that result from involved technical processes, but also are functioning at the level of a concept, at the level of an idea, which all gets sort of collapsed into the envelope. So maybe we can look at.
Well, it was, let me continue.
Please.
With that. The mail exhibits were really not connected with correspondence art or Ray Johnson. It was more our frustration of accessing the US hegemonic market, being foreigners and not being accepted. In particular, Latin American artists were sort of segregated from the exhibition circuit. So we decided, okay, if the exhibition possibilities don't come to us, we just make them, and decided to exhibit in envelopes and create our own exhibitions system, which coincided with Ray, who we eventually met and became good friends with. He actually lived a couple of blocks away from where we lived, and we shared the mailman who would give us messages besides the packages. But so that was one thing. The project in MoMA had a different thing also. We were very skeptical, I mean, in the group, some more than others, but we were skeptical about the Museum of Modern Art. And at the same time, we're aware that not to participate was suicide, artistic suicide. So how do we participate in this show, which was a mega show, keeping our honor and hopefully creating the bankruptcy of the museum? So the idea here was that millions of people would fill the envelope and therefore put the museum in the position of having to finance mailings beyond their budget possibility. And this was carefully explained to the curator, who smiled and doubted that we would be successful, which he was right about it. But the intention was there. So it was at the same time using the museum for our fame and credibility, and at the same time subvert the system and bring it to its knees. And so it was a good intention.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's really an important distinction. And also it's very interesting to think about the work as kind of a subversion from within. Do you want to say a few words about this piece specifically? I'm especially interested in the sticker, and it has a very direct mode of address to the viewer, to the participant, a straight thick line that runs from here through you to the end of the room. I'm curious who's being confronted, and also the ways that having something about space that's going to travel through space in the mail, in what ways that's subverting the sort of seemingly directness of mail as a form of communication.
Well, it was also the possibility of putting it in elevators and bathrooms, so to break down the walls of the exhibition space. And for me personally, I never understood really why creative writing is a separate area from creative painting or creative whatever. So if we're dealing with creation, we're dealing with a particular way of solving problems. So in '66, I started incorporating language in order to describe visual situations. And these were the first examples. This is a mirror. Your written sentence actually was my breakthrough. It was the first one in which I found that a sentence can change your perspective, literally your visual perspective, by shifting positions.
That's very interesting. Thank you. And then I wanted to also include Castillo's contribution. So this piece was intended to be folded back and forth, and I'm curious the implications of the fold. We think about printmaking, the last thing you want to do with the print when you've just taken it off is to fold it. So I'm curious to hear, why fold? Is it irreverence? Is it making a spatial configuration? Is it altering the sheet of paper? I'm really curious to hear.
Well, the important thing was the edition, but also it will open the idea of printmaking to more to the multiple, to the idea, like, for instance, you can fold it, you can wrinkle it, you can, there are many, also, like, for instance, like Luis wrote actually in the catalog of the show, it was in Venezuela in the museum, that the idea of the edition was more important than the work in the plate, itself. I mean, Luis can explain it better.
No, the edition being kind of the most radical part of printmaking. And so in a sense, by having so many people come and fold this, there's a kind of an edition that's produced, but also the gesture itself is editioned because it's repeated.
And then we also were including, for instance, in this case, is an offset print, like in printmaking in general was either etching, woodcut, or litho. And the more commercial techniques were not used.
Subverting that, yeah. And yeah, please.
No, in this case, it also, once it was folded, it was connected with José's aesthetic of using rectangular or semi-rectangular images in series. So this was like a synthesis of that.
Yeah.
But the change from making matrices to printing was really the bridge between traditional artisanal printmaking, which is the usual definition, and industrial printmaking, which is the circulation of whatever is being produced. And there was a conceptual jump for us, which was very important, because it allowed us to really conceptualize and decraft printmaking, and therefore liberate it into a problem-solving instrument and not just a making instrument. And there are many contradictions that are still ruling printmaking, like the actual investment of labor of the artist is in the matrix. And so in painting, it would be a painting. In printmaking, it would be the matrix. That's where the parallel is. And yet in printmaking, you're supposed to destroy that matrix after you finish and consider the prints, which are a secondary product from the craftsman point of view, as the originals. Now, this doesn't jive in terms of logic or of thinking process. It's a really nearly a religious thing, or based on superstition, which you shift the icon from where the icon actually is to something that is an attribution of that icon, which is a piece of paper, which bears a signature to make it credible and makes a contractual connection with the public that has nothing to do with what you did. That's very puzzling, and it's strange that nobody really went into that in a deep way and wrote a book about it or a doctoral thesis. I mean, it's not my task to do that. But maybe some doctoral student picks up on that.
I certainly hope so.
Mixing printmaking and religion on this level. It's an unexplored topic.
For sure. And I think it's what you're saying is really helpful for my own understanding of the ways that in these works, the New York Graphic Workshop was defamiliarizing print in certain ways, forcing us to think about print and the people, printmakers, as doing kinds of labor that we don't necessarily associate with these practices, but also as essentially the strangeness of print coming out in these pieces. And Liliana, you mentioned to wrinkle, and I would be remiss if we didn't talk about also your contribution to the.
Yeah, this was my exhibition, my mail exhibition, and was this paper that had, and here you don't see it very well, but had the image of a wrinkled paper, and it says to be wrinkled and thrown away. So the person who received the envelope was supposed to wrinkle it and throw it away. And so it was on one side an edition of a gesture, and on the other side something that later and still interests me, which was the simultaneity of the image of something wrinkled and the wrinkle itself, the illustration of itself. One thing I want to point out is to think how things have changed, because as you notice, the exhibition was number 3. The first 2 were 2 men. And who was the third one? Me. Now it would have changed totally if the young people were supposed to do this.
I love that.
Yeah, we huddled, Jose and I huddled together, and let's put this woman in third place.
And I'm so grateful you did, really.
I'm glad you finally acknowledged.
Oh my goodness. Well, I would also love, Ursula, to hear from you a little bit just about this project, about the mail exhibition and its importance for conceptual art. I'm especially fascinated by the ways that Liliana and Luis have been talking about this as deconstructing print, as forcing us to view print in new ways. And I'm curious to hear from you about, from the perspective of a curator, how to restage these kinds of pieces, these kinds of interventions in a curatorial way, but also how you see these works acting pedagogically on their viewers, making their viewers think in new ways about print. I would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Nora. Where to start? I think I will start with the question of how to recreate these works. When we were working on the show, and this is some years back, it was 2018. I think the question of restaging installations that had not been really presented since the first time they were presented was a very big one, which, for example, led us not to restage any of Guillermo's installations because we didn't feel we had enough historical material to inform installation decisions. Even though we had visited his widow in Venezuela, there was not enough historical references. But in the case of Luis and Liliana, it was different. It was an opportunity to of course, use what existed as historical documents, photographs mostly of the installations at the time, and then have their voices inform curatorial decisions in the gallery space. I would say though, and now I admit to it fully, I think I did back then, but when we installed living room, Luis was very displeased because of the size of the installation. And Luis and I had the opportunity to restage that installation for his retrospective at the Reina Sofia. And it was upon reinstalling the work at that moment that the memories of the Blanton's installation came back. And of course, Luis was clearly right. It was a very reduced version of the work that did not really, I think, represented the intention behind living room, which is, it's an installation that demands space.
I just wanted to move to show that this is the model for living room. And then we have this image of it. My apologies for interrupting.
I would say for the students, I mean, the Blanton is, of course, a museum situated in the University of Texas. So a big motivation behind, at the time, and I would imagine it's the case now, was always thinking about the audience of students that would come to the museum. And I think the installations that would welcome visitors, that you would begin the show through these installations, were fantastic ways of engaging a young student population in thinking of printmaking. So I believe that our thinking behind where to situate these pieces that were meant to be interactive. So Liliana's piece of grabbing a piece of paper, wrinkling and throwing it on the floor, the shadows that were painted against the wall of non-existent people were ways in which young people very quickly entered the show, the imaginary of the show, and then later the particulars of printmaking were presented to them. And that, I think, created a lot of positive experiences where people maybe would not have ventured into an exhibition that was about printmaking, and suddenly was about the ideas behind printmaking, which, you know, it was in essence what the show was really aiming to craft, and the ideas that really shaped a very young Camnitzer and Porter at the time and led them to become the artists that they are now, and not perceived as the printmakers or any kind of media that defines them artistically, but rather the thinkers behind the expressions on the wall at the time.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely fascinating. And what you say is so interesting about people that sort of might not necessarily go into a print exhibition, entering and then kind of becoming acquainted with the work and then realizing how much it's about print. That really mirrors my own experience of your work, of becoming interested in it and then realizing the degree to which it's about print. And that's actually a beautiful transition to maybe we should talk now about the installation pieces that you all did in 1969 at the Museo de Bellas Artes in Caracas and the Museo de Bellas Artes in Santiago. And I had wanted to share Jose's piece first. Unfortunately, I don't have a better image, I'm sorry, but I think I would love to hear one of you all speak about the relationship between this and the folding of the paper, because you really see in this work that relationship, but on such a different scale. And I'm curious how this work might resonate in a physical space.
That was a really big question at the time. We didn't do the pieces precisely because we couldn't find all the answers. But Liliana and Luis, you may want to speak to it, because this image and maybe a couple more were the only historical references we have to the piece itself.
Well, he was very interested in modules, no, and interchangeable, like they were like pieces that could be interchangeable. I think you can move the pieces, and it was more closer to a multiple, right? Luis? Luis doesn't say anything.
Yeah, I mean, at the time I felt, and I still do, there are a little bit too much objects. And he, in these, I think Jose was faced with a major exhibit in Venezuela where he hadn't exhibited before. And so that he was probably torn between having something that is not present, something that needed to assert his presence. And so this became a little bit ambiguous. I mean, he obviously undid the notion of shelves, like de-shelved them. And they also had color behind it. So there was an iridescent quality reflected by the Formica. But they were very aesthetically pleasing objects that had their own presence. And in that sense, I think he contradicted a little bit himself, which was odd because Jose really was the bullshit cutter in the group. And when we discuss things, he would immediately go to the core in an amazing way. And for the living room, my first approach was to have the words sandwiched in plexiglass and screwed together, which was totally crazy and Kafkian because there would be thousands of words. I mean, just labor, from the point of view of labor, was impossible to do. And he just looked and said, why don't you just Xerox the words and lose them, okay? Which was exactly what was needed. And in that sense, his collaboration in the group was crucial for both of us, that he would immediately go to the point. And in this particular work in the museum, I think he didn't apply it to himself, and we weren't lucid enough to apply his medicine to him. He was the owner of the medicine, not us. And anyway, they actually still exist. I found out recently that somebody has them in a basement or something. I don't know what stage they are, but they haven't disappeared.
I did not know that. That's fascinating. And I also didn't know the role that he played in the evolution of this work. The Xerox is something that I am fascinated by as a print technology that sort of lurks just below, like where we all interact, or maybe more some of us than others, but I interact with Xeroxes all the time. And yet the degree to which that's a print technology is something that is not, I think, sufficiently appreciated or studied. And so I'm curious, Luis and Liliana, to hear about what the Xerox is doing in this piece and the effect for the viewer, for the audience member. And if you could speak also to the continuing role of language.
Well, the Xerox, what happened, this piece of Luis in Xerox allows him to make a multiple because it was very easy to have many words printed, you know, that he needed, let's say on the wall that says flower, 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 no? And so it was at that time a fast way to reproduce the words.
Definitely. The speed, I think, is critical.
Mm-hmm.
And in what sense in this piece, Luis, is how I think that there's a kind of a fusion of the work that you're doing with space and also language that's kind of being collapsed here for the viewer. And I'm wondering if you could speak about precisely what you're deconstructing here or what you're defamiliarizing at the levels of language and space.
Well, in some ways, the space I tried to work on from those times on was the mind of the viewer and not the actual gallery space. So in that sense, it's pedagogical work. I try to educate the viewer to take off and not to depend on me. And what was interesting in this, number one, the whole show fits into an envelope. So it was truly dematerialized.
Yeah.
And second, it led to imagining the space through the words in the way the space was designed. And one thing that I hadn't expected, but was a sign of success, was the opening in Caracas had about 2,000 people. It was on a Sunday morning, so people seemed, instead of going to church, they came to the museum, which was a tradition of the museum. And they all walked in and walked over the centerpiece, which you can see on the image, which was a rug. But they carefully went around the set table that is on the left, or the sofa and the coffee table that's on the right. So they got totally involved in what was being presented. And I thought that was great. Okay. At the same time, it meant that the fetishism of the art object also was broken, which was parallel to Liliana's piece, in which people could come and rip off from the wall and wrinkle it. So the actual destruction of the piece was part of the piece and enhanced the piece instead of being something forbidden. So there was another borderline we tried to break.
I love that people are walking around. That's amazing.
The main function of the group, even if we weren't totally explicit about it, was to break down frontiers and we all were printmakers as a tradition. We were raised as printmakers and were resentful printmakers because there was a love-hate connection in which we felt that printmaking was determining how we looked at the universe, instead of allowing us to look at the universe. And there, the break came fairly early, I would say late 60s, in which we decided, okay, we're not printmakers trying to do art, of which we felt there were very few successful people, but we were artists who were using printmaking whenever we needed it. And that, although it sounds trivial and not very sophisticated, but for us was a huge shift, a huge step to take.
I don't think it sounds trivial at all.
And then we suddenly were free.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Well, so I want to be sure that we have time for questions at the very end. So quickly before we do, I just want to look, Liliana, at your Wrinkle Environment installation, just very quickly, which is, I'm really interested in talking about the viewer and the degree to which this piece makes the viewer into a kind of an artist. And I'm curious to hear about your intention with the piece, but also, is the viewer a printmaker? In a sense, they're part of an editioning process as they pull from the wall and wrinkle. To what degree were you intending to make your audience printmakers, and how was this audience participation important to you, and why?
Yeah, not printmakers, but to participate in like the whole system and the whole process, no, of art, to get them inside and not as spectators just from the outside. So this a particular photograph was one of the walls in the Museum of Fine Arts in Caracas. And it was a whole room that started, because the the texture of the pieces, they were printed in offset and were the texture of a wrinkled paper that started to get wrinkled, and then the last wall was just a ball of paper. And I included those pads of paper that people could tear off and wrinkling and be part of the process. Then the second photograph is because we had in the same year 2 shows, the one at the Museum in Caracas, and this was in the Museum of Fine Arts in Chile. And very fast, I like these offset prints the image is photographic. It's the first time I use photography in this, and then in my book, Wrinkle, that were photo etchings. Because before, the image before, the wrinkle was made with a super traditional technique, which is called soft ground in etching. I myself was, getting out of the technique and thinking more in terms of problems. And then I realized that it was more effective if the wrinkle was more realistic. So I used a photograph, I did the offset prints, and here are the pads that people can tear off and wrinkle.
Thank you so much. And this is one of my favorite detail photographs.
That actually was in the atrium at the museum in Chile. And there were a lot of sculptures. And actually we did, Luis and me, we did it together to add a wrinkled paper and change totally the perception of the sculpture, because it looks like they are really relating with the piece of wrinkled paper.
I love that. I think it's so whimsical, but yeah, it really looks like they're doing their thing. I love it. So I know that we are coming up on time, and I want to be sure that we take time for any questions. But before we do, Ursula, I would like to turn to you again, and I'm so curious to hear you share about the impact of the New York Graphic Workshop on printmaking and our concepts of printmaking, because these installations, at least for me, they are truly so far from what we think of when we think of a print or a work on paper. And they're also so actively forcing us to think in new ways as viewers, but also I think as curators. So I would love to hear how you understand this intervention having an impact, and maybe if there are things that you as a curator have learned from working so closely on their practice. I would be really interested to hear.
I mean, I learned without doubt. I think this show was transformative for me as a curator. I think, beyond the particulars of the history of printmaking and conceptual art, I think it was formative in the ways that I think about art. I think it really, in a way, it did what they were doing. It really broke down the particular ways in which I was absorbing and reading and understanding art to create something entirely new, because the material on this show needed it. It was always, I think, our wish that after this exhibition, more shows could be generated based on the time, because we were able to do the first step, but it was the tip of the iceberg in our view. There was a lot that could be further examined. Even I think the concept of fanso, the object that was supposed to be distributed, of course, it was addressed in the show, but that in itself could have been an exhibition that really, I think, if you think of social media today, in a way, a fanso is very much in line with what's happening in terms of distribution of work. So I think the New York Graphic Workshop for me it definitely, I think, had an impact on printmaking, just because of the number of artists that were able to get funding through the Fanso Foundation and were able to come to New York. So there was a direct, I think, impact on printmakers that were coming to New York, supported financially by the sale of work of Juan Trapadori. But I think that the impact may have been more larger than just the printmaking community. I think there is an impact that has to do with how one how artists can help us see the world in a different way. And I think that the New York Graphic Workshop really did that and does that. Even now, in rereading the catalog, which I did for this panel, it felt like time had not gone by. Like this material feels still so fresh. And the ideas that they were dwelling with back in late 60s, they haven't lost resonance or poignancy. So I think the repercussions of what the Neographic did in terms of ideas is still present and will be lasting. As Luis said, it would be wonderful if there were more research, more exhibitions on the subject itself. And I think Trapadori has been a subject of curiosity for others, and the work has been exhibited in different situations, now kind of more fully acknowledging what this project of Trapadori meant for the artists. But I think that the impact, I think, is still something we'll see into the future, because I think the world of ideas they created continues to resonate.
I absolutely couldn't agree more. And yes, everyone should check out the incredible catalog that Ursula co-edited, which I feel the exact same way in terms of how fresh the work is and how much it speaks to our present moment. And I'm wondering if in the last few minutes, should we talk about Juan Trapadori, who he was and how he came to be and the story of him? Would Luis and Liliana, would you like to speak about him?
Oh,
Juan Trapadori.
No, who should talk? Liliana, talk.
Luis.
Well, there was, I think it started, there was something called SAGA, Society of American
Graphic Art.
Art. And we decided to create this printmaker with a totally anonymous image that was like a handprint, and I don't even remember what it was. It wasn't very good, but the idea was to have a person for whom we created biography and sent this print, which wasn't ultimately accepted by Saga. I guess it was too far out. But the printmaker was Paraguayan, because Paraguay was underrepresented in the art market and art history of contemporary at the time. That fortunately changed. We decided, for whatever reasons, that he was an orphan in which he lost his parents in a car accident, but he also lost the use of his legs. And initially had been a concert pianist, but couldn't continue because of the accident, and got involved in printmaking and had a press designed so that he could operate it from his wheelchair without falling around by turning the cylinders, whatever you call them. And well, on and on. And he was a recluse and nobody could really meet him and know him. So that was Trapadori. And Trapadori was a play on trepar, which means climbing the ladder of meritocracy and so on. So it was a very cynical name. And at some point we decided to use him as a cover for needy Latin American artists who were struggling in particular projects. And so we invited them to create further anonymous images unrelated to their own language and tried to sell those prints. And we got a publisher who did buy them, not knowing what was going on. And the income would then go partially to a foundation we created, which was the Alfonso Foundation, and the rest would go to the artists that created the work and solved the problems. And then we also found that Pratt Graphics had a matching fund program, so that we financed, put some money for tuition for Latin American artists to work there, and Pratt doubled it accordingly. So we did that, I don't know, for 6 or 8 artists, and then things die off.
Yeah. But what was also interesting was that because this publisher used to buy a lot of work from us when we were more expressionistic, and when we started to be more conceptual, he stopped buying. So we knew exactly what he wanted. So so that's what the artists would do. And was interesting because they were very like happy prints and sort of a little corny, and but at the same time, one thing that is very interesting, a lot of artists who were really very serious with their own work were so liberated doing these prints, and they really love to do flowers and things like that, that I think is another thing to analyze, the concept of freedom, that one lacks.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. Well, I could keep talking and asking you 3 questions for hours. I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to speak with you. And I just want to say thank you so much to APS and IFPDA for making this possible. And again, thank you all so much for joining us. It has been an absolute pleasure on my end, and I know I will be thinking about some of the ideas in this conversation for a long time. So thank you so much.
One last thing. So thank you all to the participants, audience members, question askers. With no surprise, Lily and Luis are tremendous. Ursula, you have done tremendous service for art history and these artists. So thank you for doing that. And so if you enjoyed this program, please know that Thursday's program is Marie-Stephanie Delamere, who's the Associate Curator of Fine Arts at the Winterthur Museum. She is presenting a program from the Print Council of America, and the subject is Gilbert Stuart, the Print Trade and the Genesis of Art as Intellectual Property in the United States. That is tomorrow. Thank you for staying tuned, and have a good day, everyone.